Our next speaker is Dr. Phillip Brannen from the University of Georgia Department of Plant Pathology. He has been a professor and extension fruit disease specialist for over 20 years, and he will be speaking on disease management and muscadines and Pierce's disease-resistant hybrids. And take it away, Dr. Brannen.
Okay. Well, I am going to be covering two different categories of plants, and that's the muscadine and then these hybrids. And so this is going to be a whirlwind tour. I'm trying to get my mouse to cooperate, and it's not doing great, but here he goes. Okay, hopefully we'll get it done. All right, so we'll start off and we'll start talking about muscadines. Now, from this morning, you should have gotten some information on the muscadines from Mark. We do have a regional guide on muscadine integrated pest management in general, and this is updated yearly, and it's at the www.smallfruits.org website, and you can go there and find that information. That will give you a lot more to choose from than what I'm giving you today as far as muscadines. We don't really have a hybrid grape guide. We have a bunch grape guide, but hybrids are a little bit different. It's something we may want to actually invest in at some point to get a different guide specifically for the hybrids. But even most of the hybrids themselves are so different than the other hybrids. It almost, you need a guide almost for each one of them. So we're kind of thinking that through as far as how to address these. But that's part of the information you can find at that site. The other thing, and Mark did mention this, there is a muscadine grape production guide that is also there that does have some information on disease management. And that's also at that same site at the www.smallfruits.org website. So consider that also. When you're looking at muscadines, there's not that many diseases by comparison to, say, a European grape. And we'll talk about the number of diseases you see on those later. But we do have several diseases that can be pretty dramatic on muscadines from time to time. Bitter rot is one of them, ripe rot, Macrophoma rot, black rot, powdery mildew, and angular leaf spot. Of these, probably the one I worry the least about is probably powdery mildew. I don't see that often as being a major problem for us, and I think you'd see the same thing in Florida as well. The others we do see periodically. I am more concerned now, more recently, about ripe rot and what's happening with it, because we do possibly have some resistance developing to some of the fungicides. But Macrophoma rot in particular, and bitter rot and black rot, we often see, and an angular leaf spot is also important for us as well. Now, if you're looking, again, I've already said this to a large degree, but when you look at muscadines in general, they just don't have the number of diseases. And it is one of the few commodities in the Southeast that, like I say, you can grow organically. I mean, you may have some really bad disease control in some years, but you could probably get by with a pretty minimal spray program a lot of the time. So it's a good commodity from that perspective. But we do have to have preventative programs in place, but they're pretty forgiving plant. If you look at varieties in particular and the coloration on these types of varieties, if you look at some of these varieties that are what we call bronze or kind of that almost a copper look, they're generally a little bit more susceptible to disease. But this just gives you some idea. This is from Bill Klein's work years ago, but showing you just what happens when an untreated and a sprayed vine, if you use a good fungicide program. But you can look at some of the diseases he saw in that particular year, and you do get pretty heavy disease if you don't spray on a muscadine, especially certain varieties. If you look at a comparison again, there's definitely differences in the varieties themselves. You look at Noble versus Carlos. Noble, one of these black varieties or darker varieties, is much less susceptible to disease than something like a Carlos. And that's generally what we see. So you can get distinction in some of the varieties. Some of the new varieties that are coming out from the Georgia breeding program, you heard our breeder talk this morning, they have pretty good disease resistance. So we had a couple of these, they're new, and muscadines will give you a little bit of a honeymoon period as the diseases build up. But we planted a couple of these this year, or actually 2 or 3 years ago, and we looked at disease this year, and we did not have disease, even in a very wet year. I mean, an exceptionally wet year where these are planted, and we did not have disease, whereas the vinifera grapes right next door were just hammered with some of the same pathogens like Macrophoma that we would expect to see in Muscadine. We just didn't see it. So they're pretty resistant. As far as the diseases, we'll go over some of these. Angular leaf spot is one that you have to be concerned about, and you do really need to have a program in place for that. You just can't lose your leaves on a plant. I always tell my students that's one thing you need to remember, that plants do not do well without leaves. And so that's a simple take-home message from that. But it will defoliate the vine. This particular disease will. The good news is mancozeb and Captan are kind of the backbone of our spray program for grapes in general, but in Muscadines, that's also true. So if you can utilize those fungicides, they're actually pretty good. And if you spray those on a regular basis, starting early in the season in particular, then you shouldn't have a major problem with this. The applications that are made prior to bloom are, and some say shoot extension, but basically early applications, and then a 14-day schedule through August should take care of that. So this disease is pretty readily controlled just by applying fungicide. Bitter rot is a more difficult disease. It falls in that category of stuff that we will see more frequently on Muscadines. It's a little bit more difficult to control. But if you look at when it occurs, it occurs at the shoot extension, and then it can set up a latent infection. Once you get any kind of a sugar coming up in the fruit, it probably shows up more. You start actually seeing it come out. But you do need to actually have a spray program in place again to control that. So it's not something we ignore at all, but it is a often observed disease. And some of these look a lot alike, so it's hard to tell what they are. Macrophoma Rot, again, in Muscadines, we do quite frequently see this. It's actually a Botryosphaeria type organism, or a fusicoccum. It used to be called Macrophoma, but I think that's no longer the case. But we still call it Macrophoma Rot. It's probably one that I worry about more so than most of the rots on Muscadines. I do see it more often. So it's one that we also definitely need to control with fungicides and a good program. Ripe rot, I've already said. This one, we don't see it as often, but when we do see it, it can be pretty dramatic. And where I think we've seen it is when we're seeing resistance to the strobilurin and fungicides in particular, but we haven't confirmed that yet. We know that's happening in other Glomerella or Calotropicum species where we have sprayed the strobilurins for a period of time. I think that's what we may be seeing periodically. We have seen it explode in one or two sites in recent years where I had never seen it like that before. But it can be problematic, and it's definitely part of the listing of rots we have to be concerned with. And black rot is very common on Muscadines. It's actually worse on vinifera grapes or European grapes as far as the fruit rot, but we do see this also on unsprayed vines. And again, the mancozeb or Maneb and Captan does a pretty good job of controlling that. Particularly mancozeb is very active, and I would just spray mancozeb until I can't spray it anymore in the season, and that should help take care of that. Powdery mildew, again, can be a problem, but practically, I have not seen it ever be a major problem for us. I think we spray enough of the DMI type fungicide, the demethylation inhibitor fungicides, that probably takes care of it. Sulfur is also something that could be sprayed, but generally we just don't even need that. Between the strobilurins and the DMIs and those types of fungicides, I think we take care of it for the most part. Now, looking at spray programs, again, they're pretty simple on Muscadine, or they can be. And so this is very different even from some of these hybrids we're going to talk about later. But, you know, basically, I mentioned mancozeb. Mancozeb has a long pre-harvest interval, but when you can spray it, it's very active on black rot and some of these other rots. I would probably use it early in the season and then switch to Captan. If you look at this particular program, this is coming out of Mississippi State from years ago. But you can just see how simple this is, really. I mean, they're looking here at mancozeb or Captan. Here you've got Nova or Abound. That's actually Rally now. Nova's changed its name to Rally. And then, you know, a very simple program. You got a DMI, a QOI, and the Mancozeb and the Captan. I would say that I would consider maybe using the Mancozeb and the Captan as the backbone throughout the entire season, and then maybe throw these on top just for added control. But I really like seeing that Captan and Mancozeb utilized because they don't develop resistance, or they don't readily develop resistance. They may not be as active, but they're pretty doggone active on these diseases on Muscadine. And so that's the one thing I'd say I would differ from that program a little bit, but that's a very simple program. I'll show you another one also here in a second. This is actually Bill Klein had put this in. He just said, this is years ago, but he said alternating Rally, and again, it's not Nova, but Rally with Captan applied every 2 weeks from mid-May through August, and you'd have pretty good disease control. He did suggest where you have ripe rot being a problem, you could add some Abound, Pristine, or Flint, which is the QOI type fungicides or the strobilurins in that category, and that would help to take care of that. This year, I'm not showing the data, but Bill and I had 2 companion trials. I didn't get any disease, but we're looking at a whole bunch of new fungicides that are out there we want to throw into the program potentially. But they didn't cause any phytotoxicity. And again, everything looked good. He got some really good disease control. And because of the COVID restrictions and things like that, he wasn't able to spray that often, but he was only able to spray 4 times, and he still just got excellent disease control. So just showing again that Muscadines are pretty forgiving. And we do have some products that are coming that we're going to put in the guide this year. Are they actually available? We can put them in, and then that will also even expand some of the materials we can utilize in place of the Abound, Pristine, or Flint. Sorry, my mouse is not cooperating here. I don't know what's going on here. Having to go to my, well, I don't know what's happening. If I get it over, I might not have, there we go. All right, got it. Sorry. All right, so this is another program. This is coming out of Barbara Smith from Mississippi, but she's with USDA. And she says that you should begin fungicide applications at bud break. She mentions early to mid-May, maybe a little bit earlier where you are in Florida, so you got to take that into account. And then just continue those applications on a 10 to 14 day schedule. And she mentions again using Rally, not Nova, but that's the newer name, Abound or Elite, which is another DMI fungicide. So just basically DMIs and QOIs. And she likes alternation between these because they're different classes. We've got some other classes we can now throw in there if we add those in for the SDHI. So you're going to have a lot of things you can rotate. And she says that one of the things that she does say in here is that you can continue the fungicide applications or discontinue the fungicide applications too much before harvest. And she's done some really good research to say that works down there. I'm a little bit scared to do that. I still say you need to continue your fungicide applications a little bit closer to harvest under our environments. But again, just says that the Muscadines are pretty forgiving. They don't have nearly the disease pressure that something like a Greeneria grape would have. So she's done work to say that's what she would recommend. I'm not quite there yet. I still think we need to continue to put in some materials later into the season, but nonetheless, she's done a lot of work on that. If you look at some of the materials that are out there, again, this is coming from our guide, and we're going to expand that this year. But you can see here that what we've traditionally had are if you look at the Fungicide Resistance Action Committee codes, we've had DMIs and QOIs, the FRAC 11s, the DMIs, the FRAC 3, and then Captan, and then Maneb, Mancozeb, those kind of products. And those do a pretty good job. You can put together a really good program for controlling some of these diseases, or most of these diseases, with these fungicides. And so that just gives you an idea of what that would look like, and we will expand it this coming year as well. Again, looking at the diseases and when they're imported, I won't go over all of these, but you're going to have access to this later. But it's something that you need to be concerned about, is knowing when these are coming in. But generally, you want to have a program that will cover all of these diseases. That's what you want to get. Okay, so make sure you do that. And you can do that if you go back to that previous slide and pick those fungicides accordingly. Now, let's switch gears a little bit. I'm just going to mention a couple of things here. Nematodes are not something we generally talk about in muscadines. We've not had a lot of information to say that they're really important at all. Crown gall, the same thing, and you probably aren't going to see crown gall in Florida, not to any large degree, because it's mainly associated with cold damage in our case. We do see it with wire rubs sometimes, but it's mainly a cold damage issue. I'll just show you a couple of slides though on some things we've more recently been doing. We have started surveying or have done some surveys in North Carolina and Georgia, and we do find the same nematodes basically that you would find on vinifera grapes in muscadines. And sometimes the populations are pretty high. So we don't know if they are causing any damage on muscadines. They could be, the muscadines may be very tolerant. I would say this, if I was going in and replanting where I'd had muscadines previously, I would at least take some nematode samples. I don't know that you would need to fumigate or do anything about it, but I would at least look at that because I am concerned that some of the populations may be pretty high for a young plant in a replant scenario, and you'd hate for replant disease to take out your muscadine. So I'd at least do that at this point. As far as crown gall, we're starting to see a lot of production of muscadines even in North Georgia now. People are moving into areas where I've not traditionally seen muscadine production, and we do see crown gall, and it will kill the plant. Again, I doubt you're going to have a major issue with that. It's a bacterial disease that really doesn't show up unless you have damage at the crown of the plant. And so I don't think you're going to see a whole lot of that in Florida. But if you did have it in the plant and you damaged it with something like a weed whacker or any other kind of damage, then you could actually bring it out, and that would be a problem. So keep that in mind as well. Mention just a little bit about dead arm disease. You can see how, we see this periodically. Mark actually mentioned that too this morning. You'll get some of the cordons will start to die back, especially when a vine is under stress. That happens. And what it is, these are Botryosphaeria type organisms in our case that come in on pruning cuts mainly. And they'll set up housekeeping and they may stay there for 15 to 20 years before they cause any major damage. But as soon as we get any kind of a stress event, then they come in and they start to kill out a cordon, or sometimes can go on down to the trunk and kill the whole vine. So it can be very extensive problems if you put a plant on this. This is an example of that. This happened a long time ago now. It's probably 17, 18 years ago. It's one of our larger muscadine producers. What you can see, this is looking down from here to the right and here to the left. You can see a difference in the amount of dead arm that's over here versus over here. Well, there's a reason for that. That was actually related to stress from production or overproduction. I think Mark also mentioned how some of the varieties, you can't overproduce them and put a lot of stress on them by producing too much fruit. And in this case, this was an experiment on the left, and actually something had been sprayed on the vines that killed all the blooms, basically. And so you didn't have any fruit production, didn't have any stress. Then you have over here, this was a year in which we had a lot of overproduction in the vines. And then we had, on top of that, cold damage in December that came in with a really cold event that further damaged some of the tissue. And we got a lot of death and decline due to Botryosphaeria in those vines on the right. So that's an example of what can occur. You don't want to do that. So you want your vines to be non-stressed for sure. There are some other things you can do. You can actually, following each of the pruning days, and it's got to be done that day, you can put out tops and M and then go back a couple of weeks later and put out rally. And that will help to keep those fungi from coming in. It's probably impractical to sterilize between pruning cuts and stuff like that. It's something we talk about in pathology, but it's just not generally something you can do. But you can go out and actually spray at the end of the day with either topsin or rally once you finish the day of pruning, and that will help to keep those fungal organisms from coming in and setting up housekeeping in those pruning cuts. And then you do want to not overly fertilize or make the plant too succulent because that also could increase damage from cold or other things like that, and could increase disease too. Just mention briefly post-harvest disease control. We don't know a whole lot about that in muscadines. We do know that the biggest single thing is if you're picking for fresh market, you do want to keep the temperatures low and bring in the fruit very quickly and keep it cold. not too cold, but cold. And you want to make sure you get the muscadines out quickly and in a refrigerated truck and get them sold within 7 days of harvest. And that still maintains itself true. There are a lot of different organisms that can get in a post-harvest way. Probably the biggest single issue, and again, this was mentioned this morning, is the varieties that have this torn stem scar are going to have a lot more of these types of organisms coming in on that. It's a wet scar, and you'll get the secondary invasion that will come in on that. That's another reason to pick varieties that will not allow for that if you're going to be picking fresh. And then also make sure that you don't wait too late to harvest as well. So probably harvest timing will be important as well. Just to mention Pierce's disease, as we go in and start going into the thought process on these Pierce's disease resistant varieties we're talking about, muscadines can get Pierce's disease. And in general, it's not that big of a deal. This photograph over here is on Carlos. If you look at that symptomology, just basically a scorch that you'll see. Not a big deal on most muscadines. There are some varieties in the past that have been bred to the point that you do not even have the natural resistance you find in the wild to Pierce's disease. So Pride was an example of that, and it can actually be killed by Pierce's disease. But generally, it's not a problem on muscadines. Not something we worry about that much. But segueing into these Pierce's disease resistant cultivars we want to talk about, Pierce's disease is the thing that limits grape production and where we can go grow grapes in the Southeast. If you look at the Vitis vinifera grapes, you can only grow those in the foothills of the mountains in Georgia and going further north. If we go any further south in Georgia, Pierce's disease will kill them. We just cannot do it. And the reason this is the case is that the bacteria that causes Pierce's disease, which basically it clogs the xylem of the plant, it will not live in the winter under really cold conditions. So the further north you go, the bacteria just doesn't do well within the plant. We also know that some of the major insects that spread this, the glassy wing sharpshooter, for example, are less prevalent as you move further north, but there's always plenty of insects, sharpshooter type insects that can spread the disease. So it's probably a combination, but actually the cold temperature may be more important than even the insect vectors as far as why we don't have it. This is the symptomology that you're seeing on a red variety of a Vitis vinifera grape. Again, this would kill this vine. This vine will die within 1 to 2 years once it's infected. You can see this kind of a discoloration that goes around. We talk about these having kind of an oak leaf pattern. I mean, it's really not exactly oak leaf here, but you can see that this goes up and down and it forms that green section, can sometimes form what we call an oak leaf look on the green part only. But that's what it looks like. And so if you see that in a vinifera grape, that means that vine is not long for the world. I already mentioned the sharpshooter insects are what spread this. This is an example of the glassy wing sharpshooter. It's probably the one that would be predominant in Florida as well for spreading the pathogen. But there are a lot of other sharpshooters that are out there as well. Okay, let's talk about some of these Pierce's disease resistant grapes. And I will mention, I don't know how much I'm going to mention it later, but I'll go ahead and mention it now too. Y'all could possibly grow some of the California varieties also. And so I do want you to realize there's some varieties coming out of California that are Pierce's disease resistant, but they're basically like a European or a Vitis vinifera grape, just with a gene that's been brought in from other native grapes for resistance to Pierce's disease. They will get every other disease that a European grape would get. So they're really hard to grow. They're going to take a major spray program. These are a little bit more forgiving. They're not as forgiving as a muscadine, but they're certainly more forgiving. So we're going to talk about these first. So you've got Norton, Black Spanish, which is also known as Lenoir, and then Blanc de Bois. Okay, so there's those are the three I'm going to talk about. By the way, these fall under the Blanc de Bois is actually bred in Florida, so it's a true hybrid. The Norton and the Lenoir are mostly Vitis estivalis heritage. They are probably a little bit hybridized, but they're pretty close to a native type of a grape much more so than a Blanc de Bois, which is truly bred in the breeding program. If you look at Pearson's disease resistance in the different varieties that we could see, this is coming from Don Hopkins' work in Florida at the University of Florida, where he was looking at some strains of Xylella that you could actually inoculate with and get some control of Pearson's disease. This is an elderberry strain. I think this is a sycamore, another elderberry. But what it shows is you can actually inoculate plants and get some control. This is not something I don't think that's ever been commercialized largely, not yet. But anyway, you can see that it does have some impact. But what I really wanted to show you is looking at the different types of grapes. Okay, so this is a Vitis vinifera, or European grape, Cabernet Franc. Here he has 67% depth by comparison to Chambourcin, which is a French-American hybrid. Just because it's a hybrid, it does not necessarily mean it's going to be that resistant to the Pearson's disease. And we're planting a good bit of Chambourcin in North Georgia, and they may be dying as much or more rapidly than our European grapes are. So they're not foolproof by any stretch. And then the Cynthia, which is also Norton, mainly a Vitis estivalis heritage. Again, just by itself, it only is at 17% depth in Florida. So it has some strong, if not resistance, at least some tolerance to that disease. And again, okay, so I mentioned this a while ago, but we do have those California varieties, which are like 97% vinifera. And we're looking at those throughout different places in North Georgia. But it is essentially like growing a vinifera grape. You get all the other diseases, to include powdery mildew, downy mildew, all the rots. You just don't have Pearson's disease. So if you really want to jump into something that's pretty close to producing like a Merlot or a Chardonnay type of a wine grape, they're great. The wine they produce is actually very good, very comparable to those types of wines, but you're going to have to spray like crazy in our environment to keep them going. So you got to be aware of that. All right, let's talk about the Black Spanish and Norton or Cynthia. Okay, again, that Vitis estivalis heritage is very strong in both of those. In general, they're pretty resistant to phylloxera, which is the insect louse that goes into the soil and can kill the root system of the plant. So that's good. You want to know that before you plant them. In theory, they should have pretty good nematode resistance. They should be able to be planted on their own root, so to speak. You could possibly use some type of a rootstock, but whether it be necessary or not, I don't know in Florida. I would consider looking at these just as putting them out by themselves, and maybe you want to try them and see how they do, but they should be okay. Make a comment about, this is Norton, and just to tell you that these varieties, if you start looking at some of the spray programs, say for bunch grapes, like our bunch grape spray program, well, you probably would never spray, excuse me, losing my voice for a second. You probably wouldn't spray these with sulfur ever, because you don't need that, because they don't get powdery mildew to any large degree at all, if at all. But if you did spray them with sulfur, this is what would happen. The sulfur will take all the leaves off the Norton. And so just because you have a spray program, let's say for vinifera grapes, you cannot translate that into your hybrids. The hybrids are generally going to be a little bit more susceptible to damage from certain sprays. We did some trials this year looking at an oil product that's supposed to have some activity on sour rot, and we did not see the activity on sour rot, but what we did see is where we put that out with other fungicides like Captan, we caused some major burn on the leaves of hybrids. I didn't see that much with the European grapes, not nearly as much, but on a couple of the hybrids, it was really devastating. So you have to be careful about transferring information from one grape species to the other. And that's a challenge for us right now with all of these Pearson's disease resistant hybrids and the others that people want to grow. We just don't know sometimes what diseases they have, but even when we do, we don't know for sure what we can spray on those safely until we do it. So I would encourage people to be very careful about what they do spray, and especially anything with like a sulfur or an oil product on the hybrids. I'd be very careful about utilizing those types of products without at least trying them first. Blanc de Bois, again, is the hybrid that came out of the Florida breeding program down in Florida. I've had that in Florida for a while. It does have a couple of the other varieties we've talked about, that Vitis estivalis and Muscadine, Vitis rotundifolia in its heritage. It can be grown on its own root. It's self-rooted. It's nematode tolerant. It does need very good drainage. It's really all these grapes need pretty good drainage. You don't want to keep them too dry, but they don't do well with wet feet. But Blanc de Bois produces a really good wine. It's a very prolific producer as well. So if it's grown right, it can do well. So what are we worried about as far as diseases in these hybrids? It's a little bit different than I would say we are in the traditional vinifera grapes, and certainly different than muscadines. The hybrids can basically get almost any of the diseases that you can get in a vinifera grape, but the degree may not be as much. For example, if I'm looking at powdery mildew, I think any of these hybrids I've just mentioned may show some powdery mildew towards the end of the season, maybe not at all, but they're not fully resistant. Muscadines, again, I very rarely see it. These hybrids I also very rarely see any powdery mildew on them, and it's just not reported to be a major problem in the three I just mentioned. So powdery mildew is an example of something that you could probably get by without trying to target with the spray program. The fungicides you'd put out for some of the other diseases will probably cover the powdery mildew, especially the DMI fungicides. So that's an example of where it differs. Black rot, downy mildew, these hybrids get it, okay? Norton is pretty tolerant of the type of downy mildew it gets, but all three of them will get downy mildew. So you got to have a downy mildew program in place. Botrytis, same thing. Phomopsis, yes. Anthracnose or bird's eye rot, they actually will get more of that, especially if you're looking at the Blanc de Bois. It's very susceptible to anthracnose, so you really have to make sure you're controlling that. Bitter rot, ripe rot, and sour rot, all three of those are on there. And sour rot in particular, the Blanc de Bois seems to be really susceptible to sour rot. So just because you're in a hybrid and it's Pierce's disease resistant does not mean you have nothing to worry about. They do require a pretty good spray program. You look at this, I've tried to break this down by some of the diseases and how much I'm really worried about those diseases. And again, I'm not going to go through all the different diseases, but you can see there are distinctions on these. Again, powdery mildew, not so much of a problem on some of these. Botrytis, maybe a little bit less on some of these, but sour rot, certainly major, and anthracnose is major as well. So you do have to have programs in place for these diseases. So let's talk about that. Get my cursor back here. All right. So again, these are the diseases and when you're concerned about them, okay, as far as timing, when are they going to be important? When are they going to come in? So again, I'm not going to go over all of that for you point by point, but make sure when you go back over this presentation that you, and if you were trying to help a producer, make sure they understand that number one, the diseases are coming in early and they're staying long. So this is a full program type of a disease control type spray program you're going to put together for them. So it's not going to be something that's as easy as much fun. Definitely a season long thing. Again, I've already mentioned this, the powdery mildew is not going to be nearly as much of a problem. Here, you know, I've said here, Norton is probably, I mean, I may be overstating it, but it's pretty close to being resistant. You get something like a Chamberson, which you're not likely to be growing down there, it would be susceptible. But the Black Spanish, Lenoir, if you want to call it either one of those names, and then the Blanc de Bois, they just don't have that much in the way of powdery mildew. So that's a good thing. That's one of the pluses from these hybrids, in addition to what we've already talked about. Phomopsis, yes, you can get that. And so this is one that would be really bad on vinifera, but you can also get it on these hybrids as well. So you might have to consider that. It can form fruit rots, but it also mainly is a cane damaging type disease as well. And so you might want to consider something like lime sulfur late dormant just to suppress this. So lime sulfur as a late dormant application is a good, probably a good tool You don't want any green tissue. It's got to be late dormant, but to suppress or reduce Phomopsis. Anthracnose, I've already said, is worse on these hybrids. And so a good spray program is important for that. But here, the lime sulfur is particularly critical. This is probably one of the best methods of controlling anthracnose or bird's eye rot, is putting out lime sulfur in the late dormant. So you can get the Phomopsis and this anthracnose, which will be even more important on these hybrids. Downy mildew, again, all of these can get it. So you've got to be at least concerned about it. It's not as prolific on the hybrids. Certainly not on the Norton, but you'll see it. And so you do have to have a spray program in place for these. This is what it can do to the actual fruit early in the season. Once the fruit get beyond about the P stage, they start to develop what we call ontogenic resistance. They become resistant to it, so you won't see it necessarily. If it doesn't infect early in the season on the fruit, you will not see it on the fruit later in the season. It infects leaves. It can defoliate a plant, and that's something you definitely don't want to see. I think it's unlikely that you would ever see it defoliate Norton, even if you just let it go. But on these other hybrids, the Black Spanish, Lenoir, or Blanc de Bois, it would definitely take the leaves off, and you don't want that. This is what it can look like if you have that happen. You can have, in this case, you have ontogenic resistance, where the clusters were resistant because they made it past the infection, but then all your leaves were infected. And in this particular case, they were completely defoliated. It's a very odd sight to see these clusters without leaves, but you can't produce a good wine from any kind of a grape that is under those circumstances. They will never mature well enough to make a good wine. Again, this is some work from a student of mine a few years back, but just showing the downy mildew susceptibility. So this is a Merlot Vitis or Vitis vinifera Chardonnay. You can see how susceptible those would be. Saval, a hybrid, very susceptible. Norton, I don't know that I agree with what came out on this particular rating. I think Norton is a little bit less susceptible, but you can see how much less downy mildew at the same time you're producing on this Black Spanish, Blanc de Bois, Chambourcin, and Norton. These just don't have as much, but they definitely have it. So that's why you need to cover that in your spray program well. Botrytis, not as bad in the hybrids, but again, you've got to cover it also. And so that means that you're going to have something like Captan a lot of the times going out anyhow. I still think with the hybrids, your backbone program is going to be Mancozeb, and then following that with Captan, and that will help with the botrytis a lot in the hybrids. But there are other times you need to be really concerned about making sure you put a botryticide out, and there's specific fungicides that are termed botryticides, and you only spray them for the most part for botrytis. And so you got to look those up in our guides in order to find that. But the timing on that is bloom sprays in particular, and then bunch closure, the veraison or fruit ripening, and just prior to harvest. So there's 4 times in particular that you need to make sure you have a really strong botrytis active material out there. Botrytis develops resistance very readily. We have botrytis testing programs in place in Georgia. We have our the fungus actually tested, tell us whether fungicides are active or not. Probably a good idea for you guys to do that in Florida as well. You could send samples to Georgia from Florida, but you just have to pay for it. Sour rot is another major problem that we see in these hybrids, especially in things like the Blanc de Bois. A lot of this is caused by damage that you can occur from various things, but fruit flies, especially spotted wing Drosophila, we think has increased our sour rot percentage. Anything that's going to damage the fruit will then allow in yeast and acetobacter type bacteria, and that produces basically something that smells like vinegar and it tastes like vinegar, and you can't make good wine from vinegar. So that's why you don't want it. What we're recommending based on some work that's been done in Cornell is that roughly just prior to or at veraison, you want to use some active insecticides that would be active against Drosophila. and then add oxidate with those applications. You've got to alternate those insecticides or you will develop resistance there. But that tends to help suppress the sour rot, and that's the only thing so far that has shown any activity against it. You're just trying to break the cycle by killing out the Drosophila that spread those yeast and bacteria and cause damage as well. So that's it. That's a whirlwind tour, and I know it's fast, but I hope you can go back over some of those slides since you're recording this as well. And I've got a few minutes, I guess, that hopefully I can answer a question or two if you have any.
Please enter any questions in the Q&A, and I see there is one there right now. If you can see that, Dr. Brannen. I can read it too. Is there a reason that resistance is not a concern with mancozeb?
Both with mancozeb and captan and sulfur, resistance has not been generally reported. And the reasoning is that the mancozeb is active on so many different physiological processes in the fungus, it just cannot readily develop resistance to that. With that said, there's been one report, actually Natalia Perez from Florida was on that paper within the last year, and I've pointed it out to people on multiple occasions now, where at least in apple with Calototricum fungal species, there's some work in Brazil that is saying that it has developed resistance to mancozeb. And it's a different type of resistance. I think this is still, I'm not saying it's not good research, because I think it was really good research, especially when Natalia was involved in it. But different people are less accepting of that. But the way it would occur is the fungus would actually pump the fungicide out. It'd be a type of a pump system that is turned on in the fungus, and each of those fungal cells pumps the fungicide out pretty much as rapidly as it comes in. And so that's the only case of resistance that I've ever heard of with mancozeb or any of these contact type materials, these old materials. And that's, in answer to your question, that it just does too many things normally for the fungus to develop resistance. But I am a little bit concerned based on that one report. Other questions? I can't see the
yeah, if there are any more, I'll read them out to you.
Thank
but
you.
That was the only one that was entered in the Q&A. So do we have any other questions? And Dr. Sarkosh, is that spray guide link on our website? Or okay, here Mark Bailey has asked, how prevalent have spotted wing Drosophila been over the past few years in grapes?
Well, it's a good question. And I'm not sure in Muscadines, because they're so much thicker skinned, that it's going to be as much of a problem. With the hybrids and with the vinifera grapes, we have seen a sharp uptick in the spotted wing Drosophila. And we do think they're causing enough damage that they're increasing that sour rot, and maybe just causing direct damage as well. So it depends on the thickness of the skin to some degree, I think, as to whether or not you're going to see a major issue or not. But we've seen an increase in it with some of the hybrids and with the vinifera. I'm not sure that I can say that about Muscadine.
Okay, there's another question here from Deanna McKenzie saying, we have had our Muscadines for 11 years. In the last few years, they have not been taken care of properly. Is it possible to bring them back? And what would you recommend to start the process?
I think it is possible to bring them back. It'll take some effort. Again, I wish Mark was in on this, because he'd probably tell you better than I would as far as what you need to do. But I think generally what you're going to have to do is train new cordons. That means cutting them back, possibly to the trunk from those cordons, maybe even below the wire to allow new cordons to come up from below. But I think that's probably the best answer where you have a situation like that, is you're going to have to develop new cordons and basically start over. But as long as the trunk is sound, and as long as there's not like Botryosphaeria in the trunk itself, I think you can usually retrain and start over again. But that's probably where I've seen muscadines that have been abandoned. They get a lot of cordon and trunk diseases pretty readily, and you'll start having a lot of dead arms showing up. And so you just have to retrain.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Our time is up. If there are any other questions, you can type them into the Q&A box and we can have Dr. Brannen answer them in the box.
Excellent.
Okay?
Well, thank you guys very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.